All right, folks, I think we can go ahead and get started here. I know we've had a long day and a half, and I appreciate you all coming to this afternoon of the second day for another interesting and difficult conversation about the complexities of police departments, especially trying to imbibe some of the lessons that we've been talking about over the last couple of days, whether it's about legitimacy and history and harm, and what the implications are for culture. We started to talk about it a little bit this morning in the plenary. I know Daryl Atkinson quoted Valerie Jarrett in saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and then Kim Fox was talking about it in the prosecutorial office, and Deputy Chief Tingarides was also starting to talk about it in Watts, and what it looks like to update culture with new information. So I don't want to speak for too long here because we have a lot of panelists who have a lot to say. But I do just want to say, all of the leaders to my left are experimenting with these new concepts in new ways. Many of you are as well. Nobody's figured it out in its entirety. And I'm pretty sure that they'd all be, if they weren't on this panel, sitting in the audience and taking notes too. So looking forward to a good conversation about this. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my panelists here. We have Officer Jeff Upson from the Pittsburgh Police Department. We have Deputy Chief Trevor Womack from the Stockton Police Department. We have Chief A.C. Roper from Birmingham. We have Assistant Chief Medaria Arradondo, Rondo to his friends. And we've got Chief J. Scott Thomson from the Camden Police Department. So we're going to go in that order, and they'll each get 10 minutes to talk about the work that they have going on in their agencies. And then at the end, we should have around 20 minutes or so for any questions that you all have. And of course, I can always supplement that section. So I will pass it over to Officer Upson here now.
Thank you, Sam. So, as Sam said, my name is Jeff Upson. I'm a patrol officer in the city of Pittsburgh. I'm still scratching my head at why I was invited here amongst some of these colleagues, just a really esteemed group of people. But I'm going to give it my best shot to explain some of the things that we're doing in the Pittsburgh region in terms of procedural justice. So one of the things that I get asked the most by frontline officers and by community members is, how are we going to sustain the teachings of procedural justice, especially in a time when there's certain rhetoric coming from Washington, right? And that's a question that I'm very comfortable in answering, and that is we're going to sustain it through the things that we do every day and the interactions that we do with our community members. So some of the things that we talk about with procedural justice, I'm going to give you a little brief overview of what we've done in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh is a member of the National Initiative for Building Trust and Justice. So we're one of 6 cities that were selected to take part in this national initiative. It's been a very beneficial partnership that we've been in, a lot of different people that we've been able to reach out to and help us do the things that we're doing in Pittsburgh. So it's really been a beneficial thing. Pittsburgh's a population of a little over 300,000 city residents, and we also have about 900 sworn members. So that's about the size that we're dealing with in the city of Pittsburgh. When you look at sustaining procedural justice, we are committed to a long-term relationship with the ideas and the principles and practices of the procedural justice and police legitimacy teachings, and we're making it a point to embed that into several different facets of our organization. So I will go over some of the things that we're in the process of doing and things that we have already done in Pittsburgh. So if you look here, our code of ethics, this is something that we reinvented, if you will. We made it explicitly clear what we expected from our rank and file, including myself. And our code of ethics was something that was rooted in procedural justice and legitimacy. And it makes very clear how we should act within ourselves, within each other, also with the members of the community that we serve. So the Code of Ethics is something at the core of our organization. We also looked at training. We reevaluated the way in which we were training, specifically how we are going to be treating ourselves within the department. We talk a lot about internal procedural justice because that's a huge aspect of all of this. We looked at policy. This is one of the more exciting pieces for me is going through the policy and seeing what exactly we can do to help mitigate some of those changes. Promotions, we looked at how we're doing our promotional processes and where we can tie in some of the procedural justice principles. Performance evaluations, also looking at how we're evaluating the rank and file. Are we looking at the principles of procedural justice, not just arrest stats? And we've heard a lot about that these last couple of days. Community outreach, probably the centerpiece of the procedural justice and national initiative, if you will, is the community outreach. So we have a lot to fix internally, but externally we have a lot of areas to improve on as well, and that starts with our community outreach that we've been doing in the Pittsburgh area. So when we look at the policy and procedures, Pittsburgh, again, being a member of the national initiative, we were fortunate enough to have some of the brightest and best minds in the nation, in the world, to evaluate some of our policies, look at some of the things that we're doing. Our Yale Law School and the Center for Police and Equity, they both independently reviewed our policies, our current policies and procedures. They made suggestions. They were able to come out to Pittsburgh and say, hey, this is what I think you're doing well. Maybe this is an area where you can improve on. And we've taken that pretty seriously. So what we're doing, and this is something that we're in the process of doing, is evaluating our policies. This is something that a core group of people were able to sit down, sift through. So I always use the analogy that we're looking at our policies through the lens of procedural justice. We're looking at how our policies and procedures are being implemented, and we're going through that with a fine-tooth comb and seeing where we can implement and change our language to incorporate procedural justice, if that makes sense. We also looked at certain language and how we're using that. We also looked at some of our consistencies with our professed ethics and moral values. So things that we talk about in our code of ethics, are we talking about holding ourselves accountable to those things? So it's a two-way street. When we look at training and education, this is another key aspect of what we're trying to do. And we look at continued training for our current members. In Pittsburgh, much like the other 6 national initiative teams, we've taught Procedural Justice Part 1, Part 2, and we're currently in the process. We've taught half of the organization Procedural Justice Part 3, which is, of course, the implicit bias portion. We've been fortunate enough to work with Dr. Phil Goff, Kim Burke from the Center for Police and Equity, and really getting the core foundations of implicit bias and getting that out to our organization. That's something that we're in the process of doing currently. Like I said, we've already taught about half of them this course. We're looking at recruit training. All our recruits that go through our academy go through procedural justice training, including the implicit bias training. We looked at supervisors training and reevaluating how we're training our supervisors. Again, this is coming from a patrol officer, so I don't really have much room to talk, but this is something that we're looking at. And training outside of our organization. So I was talking to several of these other members here, and we're teaching other organizations because, like the President's Task Force found, there's 18,000 autonomous police agencies in the nation. We're just one of those police agencies in our Allegheny County. We've taught the Allegheny County Police, we've taught Port Authority Police, we've taught different agencies within the Pittsburgh region because it's more than just Pittsburgh, right? When we put on this uniform, we're representing a profession. So we're making sure that we're reaching out to our partners in and around us to also go through these classes. And then probably the most exciting one is our community outreach. This is something that we've been doing. We sort of took it upon ourselves to make sure that we were teaching this to the community and taking out the principles that we've taught to our members, because the biggest questions I got after teaching 900 members Procedural Justice Part 1, this is all great, but are you going to teach this to the community? And the answer was yes, absolutely. Empirically, we're going to go out there, we're going to teach the members of the community, the people that we're serving. So this is something that we developed. So to date, we've had over 14 community groups go through the procedural justice training. That's numbering about 500 members of the communities. We've had a lot of repeat attendees. We've had people that showed up a couple times. And I'm very happy to say that. And we have many more. I just got an email this morning from someone saying, hey, I'd like the procedural justice training. So it's something that are really proud of doing in and around the Pittsburgh area. So we have engagement with those organizations. We hear what they're saying. One of our principles of procedural justice is voice. We allow them to have a voice. We have many discussions on things that are happening at the local level. We're talking with our stakeholders, people that are actually in the areas working and living. So we have those sometimes tough discussions, right? But it's very beneficial for us as an organization. So when we talk about sustaining procedural justice, I'll leave you with this, that at least in Pittsburgh, the analogy is that procedural justice isn't just simply a concept. It's the way in which we police. So that's something that we've really pledged to in Pittsburgh, is really holding on to these things and sustaining it throughout the course of the future. So thank you.
Sam? There we go. Okay. Can you hear me? All right. Good afternoon. My name's Trevor Womack. I'm a deputy chief with the Stockton Police Department of California. As Jeff mentioned, I'm just honored to be here. After the past day and a half listening to all the different speakers and panelists, I'm still kind of amazed that I'm up here on a panel as well. So it's just an honor to be here, and I hope that I can contribute to the conversation that we've been having in some small way and add to this body of knowledge that we're all working on. So hopefully I can accomplish that today. Talking a little bit about shifting culture and practice, especially as it applies to intelligence-led policing and principled policing. We're just doing things differently in Stockton. We're policing in a different way. I think it's important to touch quickly on the context where this work is coming out of in Stockton. You may or may not know. Oh, you get that for me? Thank you. I don't want to make the same mistake that Vaughn did, huh? Yeah. Sorry, Vaughn. Yes. There was a period from about 2008 through 2015. There was a lot of disruption and instability in Stockton. Before Detroit, we heard from Detroit yesterday, Stockton was the largest municipal bankruptcy in the country. And so we came through a period where we were going through extreme financial cuts, staffing cuts, and at the same time, violence was spiking. And for me, that was telling as well. You know, I think as law enforcement leaders, you're never quite sure how much impact you really have on the community as far as crime. You never really know what you're preventing, what you're stopping. We got to see it firsthand because we cut 100 positions, and then the very next year we had record high crime rates. It just shot through the roof. So for me, that was very telling about at least the impact that we do have on our community regarding crime. So we lost about 25% of our sworn staffing by cutting 100 positions. Not using that. So we went from about 440 to 320 overnight, and there was also a mass exodus of officers because their pay was cut between 18 to 23%, and so they were all jumping ship and leaving for other agencies. So we were in a really bad spot, again, with the crime spike as well. Go ahead. Thank you. So along that, within all that, a new chief came on board, Chief Eric Jones, and he brought with him some visionary, very visionary leadership and some real stability to the department that was needed. And quickly, he brought with him a new policing philosophy that we worked together on as a team, solidifying. And one pillar of that philosophy is smarter policing, intelligence-led, data-driven, evidence-based practices, right? The other pillar is principled policing, which has much more to do with our character, who we are as an organization, as an individual police officer, how we interact with our public, procedural justice, those type of concepts. While those are all overlapping almost in everything we do, they are still two distinct pillars in our policing philosophy. So I'll be touching on those today. Wrapped into that from 2012 to 2019, where we're going, and I said 2019 because we just finished our 3-year strategic plan that goes through 2019. Obviously, the work will continue beyond 2019. Also, a focus on internal officer wellness. The chief recognized with the trauma that we've been through as an organization, we not only needed to invest back into our community, but internally within the organization. So we really put a lot of effort into building an outstanding wellness network. We were actually just recognized nationally with an award through Peace Officer Memorial Fund just this past May at the memorial. So let's jump into just 3 practical examples of what we're doing, how we apply the work that we've been talking about for the past day and a half, how we're actually applying that within our agency. So we have a meeting that we created and it's still in development called ICAP, Information, Communication, and Planning. Think of it as a CompStat 2.0 or even a CompStat 3.0 actually. I think everybody's familiar with CompStat. We've had our own versions along the way too. But now we're trying to be much more data-driven and evidence-based to create this focus in our department. And ICAP is much more about geography-based policing. I'll talk about ceasefire later. We're talking about hot people, right? Individual central focus. This is more about geography-based policing. So we have some pretty powerful analytical tools and software that produces forecasts for us. It's based off data sets of gun crime only. So homicides, injury shootings, armed robberies. Take about 6 months worth of that data. The computer magically tells us the areas in town where predict or forecast the highest risk of gun violence for the next 30 days. We take that into a monthly meeting, our ICAP meeting, and the first half of the meeting is about area selection. There's about 30 or 40 people in the room from all over the department, our managers, our sergeants, patrol, all areas of the department, and we argue and debate out of those 6 areas, which one do you think is the area where it's most likely someone will be shot tonight or in the next couple weeks? And that's the basis for the selection. So we go through this area selection process, and then once we settle on that, we switch into a strategy development session during the meeting. And that's led by one of our captains. It's a facilitated strategy meeting, and it's a whiteboard exercise that we do. Draw a line right down the middle, and on one side you could think of more traditional type tactics of things we want to try in the neighborhood to impact crime. On the other side is all about community engagement. What are we going to do to build trust with our community while we impact crime? Because in Stockton, we believe those aren't mutually exclusive concepts at all. You can reduce crime and you can build trust at the same time. And that's what this meeting is about. It's deploying people into officers and resources into neighborhoods based on the data, but having them police in a new way, okay, in a very targeted, focused way. So you can see those 2 principles there that I was talking about. It's evidence-based, data-driven, but we're also on the principled policing side, making sure that our interactions with the community are proper. So let's go to the next one. Another example is our strategic plan, and the note I made on here was process matters, because anybody can write up a strategic plan and post it on their website and say, here's what we're going to do. To me, I'm a process guy, and procedural justice is a lot about process as well. And so I wanted to develop a strategic plan in a new way, and I wanted to have input from up and down the organization. I wanted everybody to have a voice in developing our plan, and I wanted that community to have a voice in developing our plan. So we reached out to a local partner, an academic partner at University of the Pacific. Peter Johnson from the Westgate Center for Leadership Management and Development came in. He was awesome. He helped us facilitate this whole process. He was a direct partner. UOP helped do University Pacific helped do a community survey at the same time while we were doing the internal development work as well. So it was informed by both the department and the community. We settled on 4 overarching goals, one of which is building and maintaining trust with our community. One is reducing crime and blight, so those same ideas and concepts are there. And we also revised our mission statement to make sure it was in line with where we are headed right now as a department. It had been 15 years since we touched the mission statement, so it's a little bit longer than this, but basically it says what I just said. We can reduce crime and improve quality of life in our communities while building and maintaining trust. That's what our mission statement says now. That's what we're all about as an organization. So again, voice, and about all of these different examples I'm giving here, you should be able to see that there's procedural justice, both internal and external, weaved or woven through all of them, right? Those concepts are just woven through all we're doing now. And then there was an implementation phase too, because we didn't want to just create a plan that gets posted or set on a shelf and nothing happens. It was important to have some level of accountability. So we developed metrics for all of our goals and objectives. We developed a dashboard with red, yellow, green signals on there to see how you're doing on your progress. And we incorporated that into those ICAP meetings that I mentioned. So on a monthly basis, we're checking in on our progress towards all of our objectives and goals. And then on a broader scale, we rolled that into our annual budget cycle. So our entire budget now is developed with the strategic plan in mind. What are our needs, our budget needs, to support the attainment of our goals? And finally, ceasefire. I don't think I need to speak too much about the details of ceasefire. Most of us are very familiar with it. But in Stockton, we've been focusing on quality implementation and really working on our shooting reviews. So we have weekly shooting reviews on Wednesdays where, no surprise, we look at every single shooting incident in the city of Stockton for the past 7 days. We assign points to gangs or groups that are involved so that our scorecard really reflects the most active groups, and then we base our strategy focused on only those top 3 to 5 active groups, and then we dig even deeper. Who in those groups are driving the violence, and what are the strategies for those individuals? So we have broad strategies or ideas on how we want to approach that group, and then we dive into lists of people, and within probably a 60, 90-day cycle, trying to either take that person off the street through enforcement if that's what needs to happen. That's a last resort. or interventions, partnership with the Office of Violence Prevention, our managers here, Latasha Weldon in the back. Thank you, Latasha. With our outreach workers, leveraging partnerships, whether it's probation or parole or our community-based organizations. So we develop these strategies in the meeting. So it's both an analytical tool type meeting and it's a strategy management meeting. You have all the right people in the room that are going to make this work happen. We've also been focused on development of the Office of Violence Prevention capacity. The tax measure that we had in Stockton allowed us to work towards hiring 120 new officers so we could rebuild the department, but it also gave us some funding to rebuild or enhance the Office of Violence Prevention with more outreach capacity. So we've been working to align ourselves very well with that outreach effort. So what happens is after our shooting review on Wednesday, it's more of a police internal meeting. Then there's a lieutenant that I have, and that's a new position as well. He's created as a dedicated ceasefire lieutenant, which goes to the organizational change that needs to happen around ceasefire if you're going to do it properly, in my mind. Carries that shooting review information strategy over into an Office of Violence Prevention meeting on Thursday. So it's filtered a bit. Obviously, don't carry all the information over from the law enforcement side, but at least we can align our strategies. So what we're doing on the police side, our outreach workers are also supporting with their outreach efforts. And then just also focus a lot on leveraging partnerships. And this will be my last quick comment. I'm probably over. The key for me, I've been doing this for a little over 3 years now as far as the direct lead and architect for our ceasefire, along with California Partnership for Safe Communities, Stuart Wakeling, Vaughn Crandall, Daniela Gilbert, helping us with this work. Regarding partnerships is there's a two-layered approach there where your executive, your chief, needs to meet with the right other executives to solidify the commitment to the partnership. For example, probation or parole. The chief needs to sit down with the probation head and agree on this is our evidence-based strategy, these are the fundamentals we're after, can you commit the resources and commit to the strategy and get that buy-in and commitment from the highest level. But then more importantly, you need to build a relationship at the mid-manager level with the folks that are actually going to do the work, and you have to foster those relationships constantly. So one example right now with us is our relationship with the DA's office is so strong that we have a specifically assigned deputy DA in my shooting review every week with me. And it's amazing the amount of intel that comes from the DA's office as well that informs our strategy. So those are the type, and that's because we're just constantly communicating and building that relationship at the mid-manager level. So anyway, those are a few examples of what we're doing in Stockton. Again, hopefully you can tell the work that we're doing with the national initiative, whether it's reconciliation or procedural justice, all these concepts are really infused into everything we're doing within the organization now. Thank you.
Testing. I'm Birmingham Police Chief A.C. Roper, and let me start by acknowledging the Birmingham team. So if you're from Birmingham, please raise your hand or otherwise make yourself known. So those are the amazing people I get to work with every day. and so this is a great panel because really you all have covered quite a bit. So I will attack it from a different angle. And so for me, this panel, when we talk about sustainability, it's all about culture and how we impact and improve culture. And it's difficult, it's hard, because culture is how we think, act, and interact. And it grows over time, and people get comfortable with it. And culture gives us cues and symbols and communication strategies, all of this stuff that is hard to quantify. And so now in policing, we're trying to change decades of culture, and it's a challenge. And so we have to be committed long term. And so I believe that every organization, regardless of its size, has 5 pillars of success. And the first is people, and the people that we select for this type of work. The second is training, and we've had some comments about training. The third is supervision, because the organization can't rise higher than the level of its leadership. The fourth is policies. How are we going to govern the organization? And then fifth is discipline, which is not a bad word. Sometimes people think it's a bad word, but it's really not. It's really doing the right things. And so trying to get all of that aligned so that we can sustain this culture change and this culture improvement that we're striving for in the national initiative and with the ceasefire initiative is very challenging. And so here are some things that we have done, and we're deep in the work. There's so much more work to do, The to-do list never gets shorter. We keep adding to it. And so we have also revised our mission statement because we wanted to get to the core of what it is that we're about. And there were some words we put in it on purpose. We also shortened it because it was way too long. Nobody ever read the thing. I mean, it was just too long. And so we've reduced it now to 2 sentences. And it is the mission of the Birmingham Police Department to provide the highest quality of service to our citizens by building trust, reducing crime, and improving the quality of life. We will protect the constitutional rights, lives, and property of every citizen by serving with ethics, effort, and excellence. So that's what we do. 2 sentences. But we wanted the Constitution to be in the mission statement because it all goes back to that. And retired Chief Ramsey mentioned it yesterday. And I just believe that the Constitution is what all of this is based on. And it has to be higher than us. It has to be higher than our organization. Because if not, how would you be willing to die for it? So we have to get back to the core principles of policing. So we revised the mission statement. And of course, we went into the training piece. I'm a firm believer that one and done training doesn't change culture. One and done training, we had the class, we checked the block, does very little for culture change and culture improvement and enhancement. So we have to stay at it all the time. And so there are some things we did on purpose. For example, I, as the chief and my command staff, we attended the training with our officers. And we thought that would send a message that, at times it may stifle the free exchange of ideas, but we thought the risk would be worth it, not having a special executive session for the command staff, but commanders attending the training with the officers. We thought sent a powerful signal that this is important to us. But we also recognize that leadership in police departments change. Quite often it changes more frequently than we would like. And so the driving issue is how do we get this into our DNA so that regardless of leadership changes and promotions and retirements, we have a mayoral election coming up in August, regardless of all that, that is infused in the lifeblood of the police department. And so early on, the listening sessions and all of those types of things were handled by me. There were certain ones that I had to handle personally. And as we rolled it out, I thought it was important that I set the stage. And we would have deputy chiefs and some captains to attend and monitor. They'd sit on the side, and I'd be in the circle on behalf of the police department. So, but to involve everyone, we had to do more because it's also an issue of leadership development. How are we going to develop the leaders we have and the next round of leaders? Because when you start talking about change, there's 4 responses. Number 1, you can resist, which means you actively fight against it. Second, you can tolerate, which means you do the minimum. Third, you can accept it, which means we'll roll with it. Or fourth, you can initiate it. And we want to develop leaders who will initiate change and operate in that space where we're taking advantage of the opportunities to have a better police department and a safer community. So what we have done, we have now rolled it out to all of our command staff. So now our captains are taking up the mantle of conducting these listening sessions. So that way the chief can become unnecessary, and that's the goal of leaders, make yourself unnecessary. And so what we've just done here on Friday, the mock session. So Friday, we just had a mock listening session for our command staff. We sat in the room. They developed questions under the guidance of the National Initiative staff, Sam and his team. And I conducted a session, almost like a rehearsal, training type mentoring session. And they asked questions, and I answered the questions as if I was in a real listening session. And then we could pause and say time out, and we could explain why we answered the question that way and why we didn't go into this other territory. And then we asked each captain a question because we wanted them to understand that this is not like the typical neighborhood meeting where you go in with the stats and give the report and take a few questions about the statistics and then walk out and say, okay, we'll come back next month and give you an update. Well, this is much deeper than that, and because we're listening, which we want everyone to know we can't be defensive. We want the free flow of information. And so we just had that mock session, and so now we just had a captain just a couple of days ago conduct a listening session with domestic violence victims that went, it's like she had done 100 of them. Well, she had just sat through this rehearsal session on Friday, and she conducted it as if I was conducting it. I mean, there was no drop down in quality. She actually did much better than I would have done. And so that's what we want from our leaders. The other thing, how's my time here? Looks like I got 1 minute and 45 seconds left. So I put the timer on myself this time. So the other thing that we have done is, and I think we will get the most bang for the buck for these, our precinct commanders will now start listening sessions in their geographic neighborhoods. And I think that's where the rubber will meet the road, because this will be at the ground level, and they'll be engaging with them. The final comment I would make is policy implementation and policy reviews. We've had the policy review, and the way we sliced that is we took the command staff. Captains are the highest level of commanders in the Birmingham Police Department, promoted-wise, and then deputy chiefs and the chief were appointed. So we took that report and we divided it up amongst the command staff. And so small groups of command staffs are responsible for each section of the report. It's their job to review it. It's their job to come back with recommendations on where we can adapt and adopt procedural justice into our policies, because we're an accredited agency, so our policies are sound, they're relevant, they're up to date, they're practical and all of that. But Khalil has never looked for procedural justice in the policies. And so our command staff now has that duty, because I want them to own it. And so we have done much better now rolling that out. And finally, I would say this, as the chief, I think everything we do send a message. The microphone is always on. So when I mentioned those 5 factors for success for every organization, I mentioned supervision. And so what we do every year, I guess I got to stop right there. I'll take one. Okay, all right. He said I can take. He said he used his time. I'll take 1 more minute. So every year I meet with my council of captains every month, but I meet with the League of Lieutenants. That's every lieutenant in the police department twice a year, and I meet with the Assembly of Sergeants. That's all of my sergeants. Got about 120 sergeants in the department. And so right now we're going through those meetings. So I just met with all of the lieutenants a couple of weeks ago. And the first thing on the agenda, if I brought the slide deck, you will see the first thing on the agenda is the national initiative, that framework. So now I'm meeting with the sergeants, and the first thing I'm asking them about is procedural justice, implicit bias. What are the four pillars for procedural justice? You know, voice, treating people with dignity and respect, having trustworthy motive. So I'm asking them. So they're sitting there with their mouths open, because here I am as the chief. I'm asking you, what does this mean? And so I think it's a good way of mentoring them and also showing them, because they're the frontline supervisors, they're the quality control people. I'm not at roll call every day making sure the officers are doing their jobs. So I want them to know that this is important to me, and if so, it's got to be important to you, and you've got to own it. And so we just had our first session with the sergeants. I have 2 more. And I know they're probably studying right now. Chief's asking us about national initiative stuff, so I know they're all, because the grapevine, you know, the word spreads through the grapevine. You better have these answers. And so then the second thing we're asking them about is what's referred to as ceasefire, what we're calling the Birmingham Violence Reduction Initiative, the principles of that and how that works. So those are the first 2 things on the agenda as we meet with all the supervisors in the Birmingham Police Department. So the other things that we're doing now, we're going into the evaluation piece and how we can get this into promotions and tie it into job descriptions and those kinds of things. so that it's on paper that this is how we police. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this microphone working? Okay. So I think I actually will kind of dovetail also with Chief Roper in terms of culture and what that has meant to the Minneapolis Police Department. So I will say that what we actually did in terms of trying to change culture was, is everyone familiar with Ancestry.com? You see those commercials where someone says, I thought I was Italian and found I'm 30% Irish, right? And it's a shock. So we actually, in a sense, did an Ancestry.com on our organization. And it was important for us to do that because oftentimes what you are told isn't truly who you are. And so it was important for our chief to conduct that assessment and examination of our organization's history and, in a sense, bring that history to light. Now, once that diagnosis, which included pain that the Minneapolis Police Department has caused many in our community over the 150 years that we've been an organization, people are going to want a second opinion. And so we had to make sure that when they reached out for that second opinion that included both community and former officers, we had to make sure that that diagnosis was reaffirmed. And that's tough for some people to take, to finally find out, you know, oh, this is a part of me that I was never told, or at least I didn't want to know about. And we found that we had some cancerous cells within our organization that had caused harm to our communities. But that's important. You have to start at that truth level. You have to start there. And so from that, we went about looking at a course of treatment that was collaborative, that included both within the organization and within our communities, and how we go about that. And a lot of that really has been built on relationship building, and it has to be authentic. Too oftentimes, it's important for police leadership to use the bully pulpit, but you have to be cautious and not to bully your message. And so we went about reaching out to our communities and on a wide sector of communities, because no one community, and certainly Minneapolis, and I know from our other cities here, are monolithic. There's several different layers to different types of communities. Our Native community is certainly different from our African American community, our Latino community, and our Southeast Asian community. But it was important for us to meet our community at their spaces and not already come with a solution. It was important for us to work with them and in concert with them and hear some of that. One of the things that we have learned through changing culture is that tension and uncomfortableness can actually be tools to progress. That's been very difficult for our organization but we're embracing that now. I was at and just to put that in perspective, I was at last year at a meeting with Black Lives Matter. For some of you who don't know, in November 2015, Minneapolis police officers shot and killed a young man named Jamar Clark, and it sparked an 18-day protests and rallies and occupation of outside the precinct where it occurred. There was also 5 people that were shot and wounded during that protest and occupation. But I was at a community meeting after this time, and one of the Black Lives Matter activists asked myself, as well as the other panel members, what is one thing that you have regretted recently since you've been on the job? And I took a breath, and I was being very honest, and I said, you know, one of the things that I regret is the fact that I wanted Black Lives Matter to be this civil rights era type of group that made me feel comfortable. I wanted peaceful demonstrations. I wanted, you know, peaceful marches where you tell us everything, the route you're going to go and all of this and that, because that made me feel comfortable. But that's not my right, and that's not my role to do that. And we have to really have these authentic and hard and sometimes painful conversations, but it's important for us if we're going to ever move the dial. The other thing I think that's very important is that we support the people that are doing the hard work. All of the cities here we were very intentional in Minneapolis to make sure that those folks that influence and are leaders, influential leaders within our department, that we support them because they're having tough conversations. Many of our officers doing the procedural justice, they're having conversations that some of our officers don't even have at the dinner table with their own families when we start talking about race and history and these types of things. So we need to support those folks who are doing the work, not only within the organization, but we also organize with folks in our community that are doing some tough work, and it's helpful to us, and we have to support them. And I know for the chiefs around the table, sometimes that's standing out and speaking up and taking a message where some of your rank and file may not feel that way. But it's important if we're going to be authentic about that relationship. Policies are another key piece. I know Chief Roper talked about policies. Sometimes policies can be created just out of a simple conversation. I had a conversation with a trans leader and a trans woman in our community who she one day just very casually said, "Rondo, what time do you go grocery shopping?" And I said, usually a weekend, afternoon. She says, "Do you know what time I go grocery shopping?" I said, "No." She said, "I go at 3 o'clock in the morning." And I said, "Why do you go at 3 o'clock in the morning?" And she proceeded to tell me because if she goes at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and sits on the bus stop, she's mocked, she's harassed, she's ridiculed, and even sometimes your officers drive by not once but twice, but then tell me to move along and no prostitution soliciting. So she says, "That's why I go at 3 o'clock in the morning." From that conversation, we sat down with members from our LGBT and transgender nonconforming community, and we created our first policy ever that was really created by our transgender community that guided officers in terms of what the level of respect and dignity our trans community members want, that all of our communities want. If my driver's license says Rondo, but I'm telling you as an officer, please refer to me as Sheila, have that respect and dignity. You can still see it says Rondo on the driver's license, but I'm telling you and I'm asking you to have that level of respect. See, these are things in terms of when we have these authentic relationships that are important for us to build upon in terms of culture building. These are important to have. Relationships like anything. I mean, for those of us who are in relationships, when you have your first argument, you don't just pack it up and walk away. You got to keep coming back to the table, but it's through that adversity. That's where we really try to forge that progress, and certainly in terms of the Minneapolis Police Department, that's where we're really trying to build and change our culture. I will just end by saying that when we started through the national initiative and garnered our team to lead our procedural justice work, it was important for me to convey to the chief that, as Chief Roper said, it can't just be a check the box. We had to look at this long term. I said there's going to be a lot of officers who are going to say, if we can get through this first year, we're done with it, wipe our hands, and we're over. So I encouraged the chief, and she was very right on. I said, let's make this a full-time unit. So once those officers in rank and file saw they just created a full-time unit for this, it made them start to think that this is going to be part of our DNA. And so those are some of the things that we're continuing to do. I will just lastly also just say that in light of the national discussions about immigration, we certainly, Minneapolis is home to the largest East African Somali population in the country. We also have a very large and vibrant Hispanic Latino community. We set about to make videos in Spanish and both Somali that talks about where we stand as a city, that we're a welcoming city, that we want to forge those relationships. We do not want our community members to feel re-victimized. So those things are important, and we will continue to do that. But we cannot progress our work without being in partner, in collaboration, and in concert with our community. So we're going to continue to keep that work moving forward. Thank you.
So good afternoon. I am the last on the panel after lunch, so I'll do my best to try to keep you all awake. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here, and although we are not a site of the national initiative, I can tell you that I am certainly a disciple of all that has been preached and taught, and I follow very closely to what you are all doing in the room, and the progresses that you are making is what we take and tailor and try to implement in our community and try to experience the same. So I thank you for all that you have done and continue to do. And a lot of what I'll talk about in a very short period of time, I'm sure you're familiar with, because a lot of it is a reiteration of what we have learned from you. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Camden, we're probably about an hour train ride from here south, about 90 miles down the Turnpike. We're a city of 9 square miles, a population of about 77,000. In cities of 50,000 or larger, we're the poorest in the country. We have a per capita income of about $13,000 a year. We're 96% minority. Up until the past year and a half, we had a dropout rate of close to 70% in our schools. One very interesting dynamic of when you really drill down into our community was that 30% of our population is under the age of 18. And when you look at other challenged cities, that puts us about 20% higher. So we're having babies. We've got the highest single-parent household rate in the country. 68% of our households are single parents. So from a policing perspective, the social inequities that drive crime or I should say the root cause issues to crime are creating the symptoms that we generally try to treat. And having come up through the ranks within the Camden Police Department, and we had our fair share of economic depressions, and in 2011 we laid off half the police department. Everybody with 14 years or less was gone, was fired. And what we saw was that our violent crime rate in our city had went to that and exceeded the most violent country on the planet, which was Honduras, right? So in the United States of America, the murder rate is 4.8 per 100,000. In 2012, Honduras was 82 per 100,000, and we were 86 per 100,000. It had gotten to the point in our community, we had 175 open-air drug markets within 9 square miles. Criminals operate with an absolute sense of impunity. We had parents wouldn't even forget letting their children play in front of their homes. They wouldn't even let them play on the first floor of their house. They would have to play in the basement for fear of a bullet coming through the window. And oftentimes when I go to community meetings, I would hear mothers tell stories how they'd have to sleep in the bathtub because once the bullets started to fly, they would just be so exhausted from getting up and going into the room to constantly see if their child was struck or not with a bullet. So the moral imperative was there to do something different. And in 2013, we started a new police force. Everybody on the city police force, including myself, was fired, and we started anew. And that did provide us a tremendous opportunity to establish what we're talking about here is culture. But at this point in time, we had very, very high levels of mistrust within the community, and for a lot of really good reasons. The culture of the organization had been one that devolved to being apathetic, lethargic, and corrupt. As one of my mentors and good friends, Bill Bratton says, cops count and police matter. And although we may not be able to address a lot of the issues that cause crime, if we operate in a particular way, we can shape outcomes within neighborhoods. So one thing that was extremely key for us in establishing this culture is identity, right? So when we take a step back and look at, we got this opportunity to start something new. How do we do this? What do we need to do? And a culture is as Chief Roper said, a culture is a shared set of values and beliefs. And culture also starts with identity. And we've heard the cliche guardian versus warrior. And that is so true. And for us, it was not just that. It was community builder before crime fighter. It was, and we would tell the officers as we brought them into this new organization, and I know many of you are attracted to come here because you look at these violent crime statistics and you hear the stories about the gun violence and the gun arrests and the car chases, and you want to be this, Saturday night event, primetime movie, Bruce Willis type of cop. If that's the reason why you're coming here, you will not last 1 week in this organization. You see, I need people that will reflect more so with being a member of the Peace Corps than a Special Forces operator in the military. We need to be community builders. We need to be facilitators and conveners. What we don't need is to parachute into a neighborhood and think that might will create equate to right. So to get to this in a very short period of time, one of the things that we did was essentially took the squad cars away from all the cops. I took the paddy wagon, you know, the rest van, the transport van, and we drove through some of the toughest neighborhoods in this country, and we just kicked cops out of the car. 2 on this corner, 1 on this corner, and said, Rondo, this is your responsibility for the next 12 hours. Do not call us for a drug arrest. Do not call us unless you have a violent crime that's being committed. We're not coming back to get you. If you got to go to the bathroom, you better make a friend. And if you want to get something to eat, you better find out who the good cook is in the neighborhood. And we made their survival within that neighborhood as contingent upon the benevolency of the people that live there, as the people that live there depend upon us to provide a secure environment without militarizing them and polarizing them so that they can just walk to the corner store. But you cannot build trust without human contact. And what we had fallen, the trap we had fallen into for far too long within our community, our police department, was the only time we ever interacted with the public was in moments of enforcement or moments of crisis. And that became the lens through which the community would define us. And more dangerously, that becomes the lens through which your cops start to identify the community. You know, there's some really strong research that with the post-traumatic stress of soldiers after the Vietnam War. And one of the most profound findings within that was that which was most damaging to the psyche of the soldier was not the visioning of the visioning experience of war, seeing their friends get killed. That's absolutely horrific. The most damaging aspect to them was the mental process of dehumanizing another individual, which is oftentimes what soldiers do to try to get through the moment and survive it. That can be the process through which you will, as a leader of an organization, force your cops into if the only opportunity you give to connect with them are in those 2 moments that I spoke about prior. So when we would kick them out into the neighborhoods, we told them during daylight hours, Rondo, you're going to go up and you're going to knock on every door. You're going to announce who you are, and you're going to find out what's important to them. Now, I got to tell you, when we started knocking on doors, it scared the heck out of a lot of people. And they did not want to open the door. They would talk through the closed door. What do you want? I don't, go away. Someone won't even answer the door. And again, that was indicative of the very high levels of mistrust that we had. But yet, as an organization, what would we do? We would historically look at our crime statistics and determine our success based upon that. And every one of us here know, right? The media and the pundits and outsiders, they'll judge our success based upon those numbers. There's not a single person in my city that determines whether the city of Camden is safe based upon what the newspaper says my crime statistics are. They dip their toe into the water each and every day. Can they walk to the corner store? Can their child play in front of their homes? These are the things that matter to the people within the community. But if we're not connecting and speaking with them, there's no way we can make their community safer unilaterally, because that is where we find ourselves getting into trouble with some of what, and you hear the debate that goes back and forth with broken windows policing and zero tolerance policing. You know, when what we found is the recipe for success for us to be able to employ an order maintenance model and not have it have a rejection by the community was we talked to the community. And that which mattered most to them was going to matter most to us. And we were not enforcing the law on them. We were enforcing the law with them. But we also took another step back. And the one thing, and I got to tell you, the one thing that I learned from this process in this group, which I was ignorant to for quite some time, was the significant impact that a summons can have on an individual, the unintended consequences. Now think of this, my community, people make less than $13,000 a year. If we go into a neighborhood because there's spiking gun violence, and we send a bunch of young cops in there and say, go secure it, order maintenance, quality of life, and they start handing $250 tickets out to people that are just trying to come and go from work, that can cause somebody to lose their license, which now they can't get to the 2 jobs that they're working to try to make ends meet. And what we did with that was we pulled all of our cops in, and we said, listen, we have the technology to know, are we stopping Rondo the first time, or is this the 9th time we've stopped him? And the preferred outcome in an interaction of enforcement is going to be a warning. And through our performance measurement process, we actually investigate our top ticket writers, and we don't reward them. We put them through an internal investigation. The officers that lead our organization every month in the arrest and tickets, they get investigated. Are you giving tickets to the right people? Just 2 days ago, I was briefed by my deputy chief that there's the local wino that I've got a handful of officers that are routinely stopping so that they can give the appearance as though it's engagement, right? And this poor guy, he's not complaining. They're being very courteous to him, being very respectful to him in the process. That's not the objective, and that's where we got to be careful as police leaders in what we do, and that we're not creating a numbers game there. Because if that is how we're measuring officers, that's going to be what we get back from it. So I will end with this and the experiences that we have had thus far. And I got to tell you, a watershed moment in my career, and I see him sitting there as David Kennedy. I had the opportunity to meet David Kennedy. Came to Camden probably about 12 years ago, and the culture within the organization, they called him a Jesus freak and said, this guy doesn't know anything. And each and every year, we subsequently was followed by more mothers burying their sons, right? When I became chief and I knew what I didn't know, and I sought out people like him, and that which is being employed here, we've embraced it wholeheartedly. And where I stand now, as of June 16th, 2017, I only have 7 murders in the city of Camden. I got to go back nearly 5 decades to be at a position where that is. And it's something that we say with our community, and wholeheartedly agree, and with our organization, is we can be a poor community, we can be a challenged community, but we do not have to be a violent community. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing all of that. And I just want to jump very quickly into audience questions because we don't have all afternoon, unfortunately. So I'll open it up to the floor here now. We have mics coming around.
So first of all, thank you. Testing. So thank you, all of you. I'm sure I speak for the room when I say that it's very encouraging to see police leaders leading by example, that it's not just talk. So thank you. So culture can say a lot without really saying anything. And one thing that I think Chief Thomson hit on at the end was warrior and guardian. One thing that's really key to the warrior mindset is, of course, this perception of danger, that there's death and bullets lurk around every corner. But that's something that's key to just policing in the history of it. What police do in the popular imagination is catch criminals. And for a lot of officers, that is also what they perceive when they look at the flyers of jumping out of helicopters and being a sniper, et cetera. But that's rooted in a sense of self-preservation at a certain point. How do you get officers that are told every day at lineup, be safe, to balance that with the safety of the people they're supposed to be serving? How do you recognize in them their right to be safe themselves without victimizing the people that also want safety?
That is a great question, and it's that really hits at the core of what the challenges that we find, and really in the frustration that you'll see with a lot of officers that are resistant to the culture change. We do not want a complete emasculation of police officers and the duties that they have to perform, and the frustration that you will get from line officers is that you got to remember that you have the mindset of people who are, when critical incidents occur and the bullets start to fly and everybody's fleeing in one direction, these folks are going against it for people they don't even know and willing to put their lives on the line. And so within that is the kindling of a warrior, which is necessary at times, but that cannot be the sole identity of what we have our officers. They have to be prepared for the worst at all times. But we do not operate, in any one of us, in a world with every interaction based upon the anomaly, right? And I know Chief Roper does this. I've read about it. in Birmingham. I see Chief Hadley from Kalamazoo up there. I know he does the same thing. With regards to is the reinforcing of that idea through your performance metrics and your reward system within the organization, and that when officers are performing consistent with the guardian mentality, the community builder mentality, they need to be held up and recognized and rewarded the same as the officer that engages an armed combatant. We do the same with our de-escalation now. We wrote sanctity of human life into our use of force policy. And let me tell you one quick story, and this is out of being like a proud father of my organization. And we ask officers to be superhuman at times. And, in the sanctity of human life, all lives have equal value, intrinsic value. And that when we're dealing with suspects, the moment they are no longer a threat, their life is as important as anyone else. I've had my last 2 officer-involved shootings. I've had armed combatants engage my officers in gunfire. And the moment that the suspect was neutralized and he was no longer a threat, and I got complete body-worn camera of one, of the very last one, the officer holstered their weapon and immediately went in the life-saving mode of the person that just tried to kill them, covered in the suspect's blood, dragging him into a squad car and driving him to the hospital so that a surgeon can try to keep him alive. And this is possible to get this type of behavior, but there's going to be consistency, and it's the leadership and the things that you're hearing at the table now. But I really think that's the key within the organization, is rewarding that type of behavior and not just talking about it.
I was going to say something real quick too to your question. I think there's a need to connect trust-building efforts with your community to officer safety. There's nothing more near and dear to a police officer's heart than safety, right? I want to go home at night, going to go back to my family. If you can make that connection and show that improved trust with your community actually is good for your health and keeps you safer, that's when you get buy-in too. And it's proven. We know this. We know this. We know that the best way to combat cynicism is to reconnect with your community and have a trusting relationship. Cynicism eats at your health, mentally and physically, right? So you make those type of connections during procedural justice training, for example. Also, you lower crime. We know now that communities that trust the police, crime goes down. It's a safer community to police. So it's for your own officer safety as well. So investing in the trust-building efforts has direct impacts on their personal safety. They need to understand that.
And so I'll just add this, I think the final comment to your question, and my Deputy Chief over Investigations is Deputy Chief Irby right there. Yes, perfect timing. Going a little farther than in the past, there was a time we conducted a raid in the neighborhood, grab the tape up, and everybody would drive out. Neighbors come out on the porch, officers say, get back in the house. And we drive away, and people would wonder what in the world was that about, and it would really lead to greater mistrust in the community, even though we did something that we thought was necessary. Now what we do, even as soon as that entry is made and we've established safety, we talk to neighbors. Go out there and go stand on that porch where those 10 people are standing and say, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's why we're here. Before you leave, make connections, talk to people. And so we're trying to teach officers that we're not compromising safety. You still need to do the things to stay safe. But as was just mentioned, as soon as the threat is over and as soon as you've established some aura of safety, it's time to start talking. Because our communities don't want hurt police officers and dead officers on the street either. But they need an understanding of what we're doing and what the goals were and why we were there and all those kinds of things. Because what I have found, and we walk the neighborhoods all the time, what I have found, when I say this, we've got to make it safer here for kids to play in the yard. Even the gangbangers, yes, Chief, you're right. Yeah, man, you're right, Chief. Thanks for being out here. Because everybody can agree on that. So now how are we going to go about it? And the way we've done it in the past where you get back in the squad car and just drive away, you made it safe, but you just destroyed trust too. And so I think there's a balance, and we have to stay at it all the time. But Captain Scott Prater back there, he really commands all of my special response teams regarding crime reduction team, neighborhood enforcement team, and all that stuff. And he's a master at it. I mean, you look at him back there, you may think he doesn't know what he's doing, but he's actually pretty sharp. And the reason I cracked him is he told me he was going to ask me a bunch of questions during the panel. So see, his hands up now. Okay.
I want to start also by thanking you all for your leadership. I'm back here in the middle. I have a related question, which is a sort of very specific issue related to reducing harm, and that is regards the public's interest and real dependence upon police to intervene in the misconduct of fellow officers. I know that federal law obligates officers to intervene under certain conditions, constitutional rights violations where they have a capacity to reduce harm, and that many police departments have introduced policies. The Police Executive Forum has encouraged these policies, obligating intervention. But to me, it seems, well, there are two parts to this. One is, I wonder if you'd speak to the cultural problem of making this a norm, where police would intervene, not just in spectacular incidents of, say, excessive force, but relatively subtle incidents like discourtesy towards the public, violations of the values you're trying to instill. How do you get other officers to take seriously their obligation to, I mean, it is a superhero sort, I mean, it's a sort of superhuman feat to get them to turn their law enforcement attention away from the public and towards a colleague, one way or another. And the second part of this is, as a civilian, I have the impression that this may happen far more than I'm aware of, but because disciplinary proceedings are so private, the public never hears about it. And perhaps the public would be more trustful of police if the public knew that, in fact, there were officers either intervening in the ways that law and policy expect, or officers being disciplined for failing to intervene in the way law and policy expect. Thank you.
So just going to your question about officer accountability, I am a patrol officer. I'm also a field training officer. So I spent the last 2 months training a new recruit. And this actually just happened where we were responding to a call as backup. The officers that were handling the call, I thought were a little bit not so PJ is what we call it in Pittsburgh. And, afterwards they came up and, they were asking, and I said, to tell you the truth, I thought you made a mistake. You were escalating instead of de-escalating. Now, these were younger officers, and I brought them aside and I said, look, this is an egregious act. This is just you left with the person feeling unsatisfied, and you were there to solve a problem, and you did not do it. And they even told us, you're going to be back here. And sure enough, a half hour later, they called back, and I said, we need to handle this the proper way. Obviously it's written in policy, it's written in law that, yes, we have to hold each other accountable. But I really think it's on those middle line supervisors, such as sergeants, field training officers, that if we're going to hold each other accountable, it's the little things such as intervening and saying, maybe we should have de-escalated. Maybe we need to give them a voice instead of we're going to talk them to, like we have been in the past. So I think it goes a long way when we talk about baby steps and just that quick intervene and say, maybe we should do it this way. So I think it goes a long way if we can just stay the course with those accountability issues.
Anyone else want to speak to that question?
Testing. Yeah, I think we are still wrestling with that, because if you interview the officers, they'll say there's too much discipline. You interview the citizens, they say you're not doing anything. And so trying to close the gap there. And so some departments are, and right now we're in the midst of, we're just rolling out our open data initiative across the city. And so we'll be putting more information online. And right now we're working through and staffing through, what do we post regarding officer discipline, where we don't violate personnel laws also. So there's a balancing act there. Because every month I have determination hearings, and my deputy chiefs have them every month. I'm firing 2 officers right now as I sit here. I signed the letters before I came. But the citizens don't know that. And so helping them to understand that we are working to hold officers accountable, as challenging as that is. But I will say this, we're starting to see more progress. When people call it the blue line of, blue code of culture and all the code of silence and all that, we're starting to see now where officers, where in the past there would be, I didn't see it, I didn't hear it, and now I'm starting to see officers that would say, hey, here's what I saw, here's what I heard. We just had this happen in a recent investigation where 4 officers said, here's what I saw. And now we're having a hearing Monday morning because 4 officers said, here's what I saw. It wasn't right. And so we're making progress. It's going to take time, though, but we are starting to see some lights where, okay, we're starting to turn the ship, but it's a battleship. It's not a speedboat. It's going to take a while to lean on the wheel.
And I'll just say too that sometimes inflection and tone can go a long way. I picked up the phone and said, "Yeah, you know that one officer you complained about? Yeah, we're taking care of that." And so at least they have an idea or a sense that it's being addressed. So
we send a letter to every complainant at the conclusion of our investigation we can't by law tell them the discipline that was imposed, but we do send a letter to let them know, to give them the courteous to say, we conducted an investigation, and as a result of the investigation, it was either not sustained or it was sustained, and disciplinary action had been taken, and thank you for the complaint. And just the mere common courtesy of extending that to people goes a very, very long way.
One quick comment. This is mostly related, I think. But if you're talking about really changing the culture within the organization, specific to the procedural justice training, my input on that is that I'm a firm believer that there has to be a level of commitment within the organization to actually do the training yourself and tailor it for your agency. So you can't just check a box and send your officers off to PJ training and think that the problem's solved. You can't just write it into your policy, to be honest with you. You have to get at the heart of the culture, which means you're going to have some internal buy-in. So if you send folks off to Chicago like we did, and you learn the principles, and you bring it back in-house, and you tailor the training for your own agency with your own examples, and use some leaders within your own agency that already have respect. For example, we have a SWAT team sergeant that's one of our instructors, very tactically sound, respected officer teaching procedural justice. So I think that there's much more value to the training, and it has much more impact on culture if you approach it from that sense.
Wonderful.
I have a question for Chief Roper.
All right, this is our last question. I think we're over time. So,
Chief, we know in law enforcement many decisions are made within a split second, and those can be very impactful decisions on the police department and the community as a whole. When we had our first Black Lives Matter protest, the large protest, there was a decision that you made on the fly. I was wondering if you would comment on that decision and the impact, the immediate impact it had that day.
That fine captain back there is referring to, this was going to be a huge protest, and I'll make the story very quick. And he and I was out walking, and I just made a split-second decision that I would welcome everyone to the protest. And so they had to walk down this hill to get to the location, so I stood there and said, hey, good evening, it's good to see you. Shook hands with every single person that walked, because they had to park in that parking lot, and I shook hands. I greeted everyone, told them I hope they have a great day, and later on when one of the leaders started criticizing the great Birmingham police chief, I said that in jest. And the crowd, and he actually said the chief was not even here. And the crowd started saying, yes, he is, because he welcomed me. He shook my hand when I showed up. And so I was still standing there. And so, and at that moment, people started to leave. And they came back by and shake my hand and said, thanks, Chief, for being here, and thank you for everything your officers have done. You all have really made this great for us. And so sometimes it's the little things that go a long way in regards to building trust and citizen relations and all those kinds of things.
Great. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have. So thank our panelists. Thank you all.